This is Station 3, your lifeline through the chaos. I'm Atlas, and if you're hearing my voice, it means you've survived another stretch of time in a world that's tearing itself apart. The time is 2,100 hours, and it's been 5 days since my last transmission. The space between broadcasts has felt heavier lately, hasn't it? It's not just the war anymore. It's the silence that presses in, the kind that makes you wonder what you're not hearing. But we can't get lost in that. We don't have the luxury. There's too much to unpack, too much shifting under our feet to let the quiet swallow us whole. The days are shorter now, not because of the season, but because the ground we used to stand on isn't the same anymore. The rules we knew, the ones we relied on, are slipping away piece by piece. That's why I'm here, to make sense of the senseless, or at least to give you the tools to try. Let's start with something you can't ignore. The skies. They've been restless lately, haven't they? Survivors from different regions have sent word about storms that seem to rise out of nowhere. Not the kind of storms we knew before, either. These are faster, meaner. Firestorms sweeping through the edges of cities, leaving scorched paths too precise to be natural. Flash freezes where temperatures drop in minutes, and frost creeps across windows like it's alive. These aren't just weather events, they're warnings. The world is reacting to us, pushing back in ways we don't fully understand. If you're caught in one, there's no fighting it. Move fast, move smart, and don't look back. And then there's the light, or maybe it's better to call it the absence of light. Entire areas are dimming without explanation. Places that should be basked in sunlight are instead cast in a dull gray haze, as if someone turned the brightness down on the world. Shadows stretch farther than they should, twisting at angles that don't make sense. I've heard from survivors who've seen their shadows move ahead of them, not following the light, but leading them somewhere. They didn't stay to find out where. The ground isn't any better. Fissures are opening up where there were none before, cracks snaking across highways and through neighborhoods like veins. Some of them are shallow, just enough to trip you up if you're not paying attention. But others go deep, so deep that the bottom glows faintly green, like some kind of radioactive heartbeat. I don't need to tell you to stay clear of those. Whatever's down there, it's not for us. And it's not just the land tearing apart. It's the landmarks. The bridges you relied on last week, gone. Rivers are changing course, flowing in directions they never did before. Roads loop back on themselves like they're mocking you. Survivors have told me about whole neighborhoods disappearing overnight, leaving nothing but flat, empty ground where homes used to stand. If you think you know where you're going, double check. If you think the map you're holding will save you, think again. The world is shifting faster than we are, and the only way to keep up is to stay one step ahead of yourself. Wildlife isn't acting like it should either. Animals we used to trust, ones that used to scatter at the sound of a twig snapping, are watching now. Foxes with eyes that glow, not reflecting light but creating it. Deer standing motionless in clearings, their heads tilted slightly as if listening to something we can't hear. Birds circling dead zones, never landing, just spiraling above like vultures waiting for something to die. Whatever's happening to them, it's not natural and it's not random. If you see them, pay attention. They're not looking at you, they're looking for something else. Maybe something you can't see yet. It's not paranoia, it's survival. The world isn't just broken. It's awake in a way it never was before. And that wakefulness is not on our side. We've moved past the point of living off instinct alone. We're in a game now, one with rules that are still being written, and we're the ones being tested. Every shadow, every flicker of light, every strange sound in the distance, it all means something. The trick is figuring out what and doing it fast enough to stay alive. So if you're out there, if you're still standing, keep your eyes open. Not just for the obvious threats, but for the subtle ones. The way the air changes when you step into a silent zone. The feeling in your chest when the temperature drops too quickly. The pull of a shadow that doesn't move like it should. The world is leaving us clues. Survivors. They might not be the ones we want, but they're the ones we've got. And if we don't start paying attention, the war might not be the worst thing we have to face. The world is angry. That's the only way to describe what I've seen. what others have reported. The air, the skies, the ground, it's all reacting to something, as if it's alive and lashing out. Survivors listen closely, because the weather isn't just a backdrop to the chaos anymore. It's a player in this war, and it's not on our side. I've received reports from multiple regions about firestorms that don't behave like any natural wildfire. These storms ignite without warning, moving faster than anyone could hope to outrun. The flames leap across open spaces, carried by winds that shouldn't exist. It's not just heat and smoke either. Survivors who've witnessed these firestorms up close describe the air itself as toxic, choking not just from ash, but from something sharper, something chemical. If you see a sky tinged with orange and red on the horizon, don't stop to admire it. That's not a sunset, that's a warning. And then there are the freezes, sudden drops in temperature so severe that frost forms in real time, creeping across windows and turning the ground into a brittle, icy trap. These aren't isolated to cold regions either. I'm talking about deserts where sand turns to frostbite underfoot, cities where the steel skeletons of skyscrapers groan under the weight of instant ice. One survivor described seeing a small lake freeze solid in under a minute, the surface turning glassy and opaque as if swallowing whatever was beneath it. If you're caught in one of these freezes, shelter won't save you unless you find it fast. The cold doesn't just touch you. It feels like it's trying to seep inside you, like it's looking for something to consume. The strangest part is how localized these anomalies are. Entire towns experience normal weather while the next valley over is engulfed in chaos. It's not natural, not random. There's a pattern to it, though it's one I can't quite map yet. Maybe it's tied to the war, to the weapons being used, things we were never meant to understand. Or maybe it's the world itself reacting to the damage we've done. Either way, it's not just the enemy you need to watch for anymore. The sky has become a weapon, and it doesn't discriminate. But it's not just fire and frost we're contending with. There's something happening with the light itself. Survivors in multiple regions have described seeing strange distortions in the sky, places where the clouds seem to pulse faintly, as if lit from within by something that isn't sunlight. At first, they thought it was lightning, but there's no thunder, no rain, just those faint, rhythmic flashes. Some say they've seen figures silhouetted against the light, moving too quickly and too fluidly to be human. Others describe the light as blinding, even from miles away, leaving spots in their vision that don't fade. I've also heard reports of darkness spreading unnaturally, areas where the sun seems dimmer, where the shadows grow too long and stretch in directions that don't match the light source. Survivors passing through these zones describe an overwhelming sense of dread, like being watched by something they can't see. One group mentioned how the shadows seem to move independently, pooling together like liquid before sliding toward them. They didn't wait to see what would happen next. If that wasn't enough, the wind itself has turned hostile. In some regions, it carries more than just debris. Survivors have reported hearing faint whispers in the gusts, voices that seem to call out their names or repeat fragments of conversations they've had before. One man swore the wind carried the sound of his daughter's laughter, even though she was hundreds of miles away. He followed the sound, only to find himself disoriented and alone in a dead-end canyon. Whatever is in the air now, it's more than just pressure and temperature. It's deliberate. These weather anomalies aren't just coincidences or isolated events. They're connected, part of something bigger. They're happening too often, too precisely to be chance. It feels like the world is trying to push back against us, or maybe push us out altogether. And the more we move, the more we disrupt, the angrier it gets. I wish I could give you answers, survivors, but all I have are observations. Patterns emerging in the chaos, signals buried in the noise. Firestorms, freezes, shifting light, oppressive darkness. None of it feels random. If you've noticed changes in your area, document them. Keep track of where and when they occur, and if you see a pattern, share it. Survival isn't just about outrunning the threats anymore. It's about understanding them, even if the answers are terrifying. So, keep your eyes on the sky, your ears to the ground, and your instincts sharp. The weather isn't just something you endure anymore. It's part of the fight. And if you're not paying attention, it will win. Survivors, I need you to pay close attention to what I'm about to say because this isn't something you can shrug off as paranoia or fatigue. Shadows and light, two things we've taken for granted our entire lives, aren't behaving like they used to. They're changing, warping, becoming something we can't trust anymore. I don't know if it's tied to the war, to the destruction, or to something older and deeper that's been waiting for its moment. All I know is that these distortions aren't harmless, and you can't ignore them. I've been hearing reports from survivors across multiple zones, and the stories are disturbingly similar. Shadows stretching farther than they should, twisting at unnatural angles even when the light source stays still. One man described walking down an empty street at dusk, the kind of street you'd expect to be bathed in long golden light. But the shadows he saw weren't just lone, they were alive. He said they moved ahead of him, not in response to his steps, but as if they were leading him somewhere. When he stopped walking, they kept going, sliding across the pavement like liquid. He didn't stick around to see what was at the end of their path. And it's not just elongated shadows. Survivors are seeing places where shadows gather unnaturally, pooling together like ink spilled on the ground. These zones are cold, unnaturally so, and the silence in them is oppressive. People have described standing at the edge of one of these shadow pools and feeling as though the world on the other side isn't the same. One woman said she saw shapes moving in the darkness, too vague to make out, but undeniably there. Whatever they were watching her. She left immediately, and she hasn't been back to that area since. The light isn't innocent in all of this either. Entire areas are dimming, not because of clouds or smoke, but because the light itself seems to drain away. Survivors have walked into neighborhoods and found everything cast in a dull gray pallor, as if the world had been stripped of its color. One man described how the streetlights in his area flickered on for a few seconds before dying, leaving everything in an unnatural twilight that didn't match the time of day. He said it felt like the light wasn't just disappearing but being swallowed by something. Then there are the zones where light behaves as though it's alive. Survivors have reported seeing strange flashes in the sky, brief, almost pulsating bursts of brightness that don't come from explosions or gunfire. These aren't ordinary flares. They seem to dance, weaving patterns that don't make sense before vanishing without a trace. One group described how the flashes appeared to follow them, growing brighter and more frequent the closer they got to a certain building. They didn't go inside to find out why. The most disturbing accounts, though, are the ones where light and shadow seem to work together. Survivors have seen their own shadows detach, moving out of sync with their bodies. One man said he looked down at his shadow and saw it pointing, its arm raised toward a darkened alley. He didn't follow, but he could feel the pull of it, like the alley was calling to him. Another group noticed that their shadows didn't match their movements, turning their heads when they weren't moving or lingering in place when they walked away. Whatever this is, it's deliberate and it's targeting us. I've also heard whispers about reflections acting strangely. Mirrors, windows, even puddles of water. Survivors say the images they see don't match reality. One woman described seeing her own reflection move before she did, raising its hand to wave at her as if mocking her hesitation. Others have looked into reflective surfaces and seen scenes they didn't recognize. Empty streets they'd never been to. Rooms that felt like memories of places they'd never visited. It's as if these reflections are glimpses into another version of the world, one that's overlapping with ours. What worries me most are the survivors who've gone missing in these zones. People have described following strange lights or stepping into shadowed areas that seemed safe, only to vanish without a trace. Those who were with them say it's as if they simply blinked out of existence, leaving behind only their footprints and the chilling weight of their absence. Whatever is happening in these places, it's not natural, it's not safe, and it's not something we can fight with weapons or walls. If you encounter these anomalies, don't linger. Keep moving, keep your distance, and don't trust what your eyes are telling you. Shadows and light aren't just physical phenomena anymore. They're something else entirely. They're alive in ways we don't understand, and they're not on our side. The world is breaking, survivors, and the cracks are deeper than we ever imagined. Survivors, let's talk about resources. because the things we need to survive are becoming traps faster than we can find them. It's not just about scavenging smart anymore. It's about questioning everything, about second-guessing even the smallest bit of fortune. The enemy, the environment, even other survivors, none of them are leaving anything to chance. Every supply left out in the open, every stash that looks too good to be true, is now a potential death sentence. I've been hearing more and more reports about pristine supplies being used as bait. Entire grocery stores fully stocked, shelves lined with untouched cans, water bottles still sealed. It's a trap every time. Survivors who've walked into these places have found themselves surrounded by drones, by scavengers, or worse. One group described how they entered a store that looked completely untouched, the glass windows intact, the aisles orderly. They barely had time to grab a single can before the ceiling collapsed in a carefully rigged explosion. It wasn't random destruction. It was precision. Whoever set that trap knew exactly how desperate people would be. Vehicles are another favorite lure. Survivors have come across cars and trucks that seem too perfect. Engines running, keys in the ignition, gas tanks full. The temptation is obvious, especially if you've been on foot for days, maybe weeks. But every time, it ends the same way. The moment the vehicle starts moving, you're marked. Drones zero in or scavenger groups lying in wait attack. One man described how he barely escaped when the car he found was rigged with explosives. He started it, drove maybe 50 feet, and then noticed the smell. Gasoline leaking from a hidden puncture in the tank. He jumped out just in time before the whole thing went up in flames. And it's not just the obvious traps. Even things that seem benign, vending machines, water fountains, abandoned shelters, are being weaponized. Survivors have found vending machines that still work, stocked with snacks and drinks. At first glance, they seem like a miracle. But the moment you take something, the machine triggers a silent alarm, and within minutes, you're not alone anymore. One group barely escaped when a rigged machine brought a swarm of infected to their location. Another survivor told me about a water fountain that seemed functional, but the water was laced with something that caused immediate disorientation. By the time they realized, they were surrounded by scavengers who'd been waiting nearby. Abandoned shelters, too, are becoming more dangerous. Places that seem secure, with thick walls and heavy doors, are often traps themselves. Survivors have reported finding bunkers that look completely untouched. Beds made, supplies neatly arranged, even the lights still working. But once inside, they discover the real danger. Some shelters are rigged to lock from the outside, trapping anyone who enters. Others are booby-trapped with motion sensors or pressure plates that trigger explosions or alarms. It's as if the shelters themselves are designed to lure people in and then ensure they never leave. The worst part is that these traps aren't just the work of desperate survivors. There's a level of precision, of planning, that feels larger than any one person or group. The patterns are too deliberate. The locations are too strategic. It's like someone or something is studying us, learning our behaviors, and using them against us. They know what we'll go for, what we'll risk everything to grab. And they're using that knowledge to thin our numbers. Even natural resources aren't safe anymore. Streams and lakes that used to be reliable sources of water are now potential hazards. Survivors have reported finding water that looks clean but smells faintly metallic. Those who've drunk it describe immediate symptoms: dizziness, nausea, blurred vision. Some say they've seen strange reflections in the water before falling unconscious, as if the surface was showing them something it shouldn't have been able to. Others describe currents that feel deliberate, pulling them toward deeper, darker areas where the water grows unnaturally cold. Food isn't exempt from this either. Fields that should be barren are suddenly sprouting crops, but the plants grow in patterns, rows too perfect, too symmetrical. Survivors who've eaten from these fields describe strange effects: vivid dreams, hallucinations, even hearing whispers in their sleep. Whatever is happening to the land, it's not just growing back. It's growing with intent, and that intent isn't friendly. All of this means one thing: nothing can be taken at face value anymore. Not the supplies you find, not the places you rest, not even the air you breathe. Every moment, every decision has to be weighed, considered, second-guessed. Desperation is what they're counting on, survivors. It's what makes the traps work. If you rush, if you act on instinct alone, you're playing right into their hands. So here's the rule you need to live by now. Question everything. If it looks too good to be true, it probably is. If it feels safe, look again. And if your gut tells you something's off, trust it. We're not just scavenging anymore. We're navigating a minefield, and every step has to be deliberate. The enemy isn't just the war, it's the hunger, the thirst, the need to believe there's still something good out there waiting for us. Don't let it blind you. Stay sharp, stay careful, and don't take anything for granted. Not anymore. Survivors, let's talk about the sky. It used to be something we took for granted. A place for stars, clouds, and the occasional passing plane. Now, it's another battlefield, another space where danger lurks, but not in the way you might expect. The drones are back, and they're not the clunky, surveillance-only machines we once thought of. These are faster, smarter, and deadlier. If you're not paying attention, the sky will get you before the ground ever does. Reports of drones have been pouring in from every corner, and there's a disturbing pattern to their behavior. They're not just patrolling randomly. They're focused, deliberate, moving with a purpose that suggests someone or something is guiding them with precision. Survivors have spotted them hovering over residential zones, industrial ruins, and even dense forests where most technology shouldn't function. The drones don't make mistakes. If they're scanning an area, it's because they've found something or someone they're looking for. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine you're walking through an abandoned street, the kind where silence clings to the air like fog. Suddenly, a low hum cuts through the quiet, faint at first, then louder. You look up, and there it is. A drone, sleek and metallic, its red lights scanning the ground in a slow, methodical sweep. Survivors say these lights are more than just sensors. They burn hot, leaving scorch marks on anything they touch. One group described how a drone hovered over their campsite, its lights passing over the tents and supplies before moving on. Moments later, another drone appeared, then another. Within minutes, the entire area was lit up like a spotlight, and they barely escaped before the strike came. These aren't reconnaissance missions. These drones are hunting. Their targets aren't just static objects, they're living, breathing people. Survivors who've tried hiding in buildings or under dense cover say the drones don't stop. They hover, waiting, their sensors piercing through walls and foliage. One man told me he hid in a drainage pipe for hours, listening to the faint whir of a drone just above him, its red light reflecting off the water. He waited until the sound disappeared before crawling out, but he swears he felt the drone watching even after it was gone. What's worse is that these drones seem to be evolving. Early reports described small, almost clumsy machines that could be avoided with basic cover. Now, the drones are larger, more agile, equipped with advanced weaponry. Survivors have seen drones firing projectiles that detonate on impact, releasing clouds of toxic gas or shrapnel. Some even carry what look like miniature EMP devices, capable of disabling nearby electronics, including radios. If you're wondering why my broadcasts have been more sporadic lately, this is why. The drones don't just hunt survivors. They're targeting communication, cutting off our ability to warn each other or share information. But it's not just the drones themselves, it's the patterns they're following. Survivors have noticed that the drones often appear in areas shortly after supply traps are triggered or after a group has been forced to move due to environmental hazards. It's as if the drones are being guided by more than just sensors, as if they're responding to the chaos around them in real time. One group described how a drone appeared minutes after they activated a booby-trapped vending machine. They didn't stay to see what would happen next, but the timing wasn't a coincidence. The drones are connected to something larger, something that's using the traps and the terrain to funnel survivors into its line of sight. And it's not just the skies. Survivors have reported drones emerging from unexpected places: abandoned warehouses, derelict vehicles, even underground bunkers. These aren't random occurrences. It's as if the drones are lying in wait, dormant until something activates them. One chilling account described a group of survivors who found a seemingly untouched shipping container in the middle of a clearing. When they opened it, they found a single drone inside, its lights blinking to life as if it had been waiting for them. They ran before it could fully activate, but the message was clear. Nowhere is safe, not even the places we think we've already cleared. The scariest part? We don't know who's controlling them. Are these drones remnants of the war, still carrying out orders long after their operators are gone? Are they part of a larger, automated system, one that's evolved beyond human oversight? Or is it something else entirely, something we can't even begin to understand? Whatever the answer, it doesn't change the fact that these machines are relentless, and they're getting smarter with every encounter. If you're out there and you see a drone, don't assume you're safe just because it hasn't spotted you yet. These things are fast, and they don't operate alone. For every drone you see, there's a good chance there's another one watching from a distance, waiting to close the trap. Don't linger, don't engage, and don't think you can outsmart them. The sky isn't ours anymore. It belongs to the drones, and they're not giving it back. Survivors, let's talk about the ground beneath our feet. The Earth itself, the very foundation we've relied on for stability, is no longer what it used to be. Landmarks we've trusted to guide us are vanishing without explanation. Roads we've walked 100 times twist and change as though the land is playing tricks on us. If it feels like the world is moving under you, that's because it is. I've heard from survivors who've seen entire streets disappear overnight. One group described how they returned to a safe house they'd used for weeks, only to find nothing but an empty lot. No rubble, no remnants, not even a hint of where the building had stood. Just flat, untouched earth, as if it had been erased rather than destroyed. Another survivor told me about a water tower that had been a crucial landmark for her group. One day it was there, towering over the landscape, and the next it was gone. No signs of collapse, no debris, just gone, as if it had never existed. It's not just the landmarks themselves. The terrain is shifting in ways that defy logic. Survivors have reported trails that loop back on themselves, leading them in circles no matter how far they walk. One man described how he followed a dirt path through a forest, only to end up back where he started without ever turning around. He tried again, marking trees as he went, but the marks disappeared when he returned. It's as if the forest itself was alive, rearranging itself to keep him trapped. Even the rivers aren't behaving as they should. Streams that once flowed predictably now run backward, carving new paths through the land. Survivors have described standing at the edge of a river, watching as the water surged uphill, defying gravity. Others have seen rivers split into multiple streams, each one flowing in a different direction. One group even reported finding a riverbed completely dry, only to return days later and find it flooded with fast-moving water. Whatever's causing these changes, it's not natural. The land isn't just shifting, it's alive, and it's making choices. The changes aren't limited to natural features, either. Survivors have found roads that end abruptly, cutting off into empty fields or jagged cliffs. Highways that should connect to familiar routes now lead to nowhere, their asphalt crumbling into overgrown forests that weren't there before. One man told me about a bridge he'd used countless times to cross a canyon. He returned one day to find the bridge gone, replaced by an unbroken expanse of rock. The canyon itself had disappeared, as though the earth had closed itself up to hide whatever was below. Abandoned structures are becoming just as unpredictable. Survivors who've returned to buildings they thought they knew have found entire layouts changed. A school that once had clear hallways and classrooms now feels like a maze, with doors leading to nowhere and staircases that spiral endlessly. One group described finding a factory where every window and entrance had been sealed with metal plates that weren't there before. They said the air inside felt heavier, oppressive, as if the building itself was trying to push them out. Then there are the voids. Survivors have come across areas where the ground seems to fall away into nothingness. These aren't sinkholes, not exactly. They're vast, empty spaces where the earth has been scooped out, leaving behind sheer cliffs that drop into darkness. One man described how he found such a void in what used to be a city park. The grass and trees were gone, replaced by a gaping hole that stretched farther than he could see. He dropped a stone into the void and never heard it hit the bottom. These shifts in the terrain aren't just disorienting, they're dangerous. Survivors have reported hearing strange sounds in these areas, faint whispers carried by the wind or rhythmic hums that seemed to come from the ground itself. One woman described how she felt the earth vibrating beneath her feet as she stood near a newly formed canyon. The vibrations grew stronger the longer she stayed, and she swore she heard something moving deep below the surface. She didn't wait to find out what it was. What's most unsettling is how deliberate it all feels. These changes aren't random. They're precise, calculated, as though the land is responding to us, shaping itself in ways we don't understand. Survivors who've tried to map these shifts have noticed patterns. Landmarks disappearing in sequences, rivers rerouting toward specific locations, voids forming near places where strange symbols have been found. It's as if the earth is following a design, one we're only beginning to glimpse. If you're traveling, don't rely on old maps or familiar paths. Mark your routes carefully, but don't assume they'll be the same when you return. The world is rewriting itself, and we're just visitors now, treading on land that no longer belongs to us. Whatever is causing these changes, it's bigger than any of us, and it's not stopping. Survivors, if you've noticed the air around you feels different lately, heavier somehow, you're not imagining things. It's more than just the weight of dust and smoke from the destruction. It's alive, in ways we can't yet explain. The air has changed, and it's watching us. People across multiple zones have reported an oppressive stillness in the air, especially in places where strange phenomena have been occurring. It's not just silence, it's a suffocating absence of sound. No birds, no wind, no hum of insects, just a void that presses against you like a physical presence. Survivors who've passed through these zones describe feeling like they're being observed, not by a person or a drone, but by the environment itself. One man said he felt the air shift as he walked, as though it were moving around him, circling him like a predator sizing up its prey. In some places, the air carries a metallic tang, sharp and cold, like the smell of a storm that never arrives. Survivors who've spent too long in these areas report strange symptoms: tingling skin, headaches that come on suddenly, and an overwhelming sense of unease. One woman described hearing faint whispers, just on the edge of perception, carried by a breeze that wasn't there. She said the whispers grew louder the longer she stayed, forming fragmented words that felt like warnings, though she couldn't make out what they meant. Then there are the zones where the air feels charged, like it's holding on to something it can't release. Survivors have described walking through fields where their hair stood on end, the static so intense it felt like the ground was humming beneath them. One group told me about a forest where the air seemed to spark, tiny flashes of light darting between the trees like fireflies. They didn't stay long, but they noticed something disturbing. Wherever the sparks touched the ground, the earth darkened, as if burned, leaving behind faint spiral patterns. The most unsettling reports come from those who've encountered the listening air. That's what survivors are calling it. Places where the air feels sentient, aware, as though it's reacting to your presence. One man described walking through an abandoned warehouse when the stillness broke with a single, sharp whisper of his name. He froze, convinced it was just his mind playing tricks, until he heard it again, clearer this time. He left immediately, but the sensation lingered, that the air itself had recognized him, had marked him somehow. Survivors have also noticed the air behaving differently in areas where symbols have been found, those spirals and patterns etched into the land and structures. The air around these symbols often feels denser, harder to breathe, as though it's being drawn toward the markings. One group described finding a large spiral carved into the ground in the middle of an empty field. The air above it shimmered, almost like heat rising off pavement, even though the day was cold. They said standing too close made their ears ring, the sound building until they couldn't bear it anymore. There's also something strange happening with echoes. Survivors have described hearing their own voices repeated back to them in ways that don't make sense. Not just delayed echoes, but distorted ones. Fragments of their words played back as if the air was twisting them into something else. One man said he shouted for his group in an overgrown city block, only to hear his voice respond from the opposite direction. It wasn't an exact match, though. The tone was off, almost mocking, and the words didn't make sense. He left without looking for the source, but the memory still haunts him. Infected seem to react to these changes too. Survivors have seen clusters of infected standing motionless in these zones, heads tilted as if listening to something no one else can hear. Others have observed infected avoiding certain areas entirely, circling wide around places where the air feels charged or still. It's as if they know something we don't, as if they're attuned to the forces shaping the world in ways we can't understand. The air has become more than just the space we move through. It's become part of the battlefield. Whether it's amplifying the presence of whatever forces are reshaping our reality or acting as a messenger for something larger, it's not passive anymore. Survivors, you need to start paying attention to it. If the air feels wrong, if it carries a charge or seems to whisper when it shouldn't, take it as a warning. Whatever's happening, it's clear the rules are changing. The air isn't just reacting to us. It's shaping itself around us, watching, listening, waiting. And the more we notice it, the more it seems to notice us in return. Survivors, we've grown used to thinking of the infected as predictable, slow, shambling, mindless. But if that ever was true, it isn't anymore. Their behavior is changing, becoming more deliberate, more organized, and, frankly, more terrifying. These aren't just random movements or animalistic reactions. This is coordination, strategy, and intent. I've been getting reports from survivors all over about how the infected are moving differently now. It's no longer a scatter of chaos, no longer a mob that rushes blindly toward noise or motion. Survivors describe seeing groups of infected working together, moving like a pack of wolves. They circle their prey, cutting off escape routes, herding survivors toward dead ends. One man told me he saw infected split into smaller groups to search an industrial complex, sweeping through it systematically. These aren't mindless hordes anymore. They're hunters. In some areas, the infected are showing an almost eerie stillness. Survivors have described coming across fields or open spaces where infected stand completely motionless, arranged in patterns that seem deliberate. One group reported seeing a circle of infected kneeling, their heads bowed, as if in prayer. Another saw them standing in rows, all facing the same direction, as though waiting for a signal. When disturbed, they didn't react immediately. It was only after a long, tense silence that they moved, and when they did, it was with terrifying precision. Then there are the clusters. Survivors have reported finding groups of infected gathered around certain objects. Rusted cars, burned out buildings, even patches of ground that seem no different from the rest. They don't seem aggressive in these moments. Instead, they're still, almost reverent. One survivor described seeing a group of infected standing around a gnarled tree marked with spirals carved into its bark. They stood there for hours, unmoving, heads tilted as though listening to something no one else could hear. But it's not just about their movements. It's the way they respond to stimuli now with an intelligence that's hard to explain. Survivors have tried the usual tricks, distractions, noise traps, and barricades, and found them less effective. Infected have been seen avoiding obvious traps, circling around obstacles instead of rushing through them. They're adapting, learning, and reacting in ways that suggest something more than instinct is at work. One particularly chilling account came from a survivor who tried to use fire to scare off a group of infected. It worked at first, but then the infected regrouped, moving to surround him instead of retreating. He barely escaped, but he swears he saw one of them make a motion, a gesture that seemed to direct the others. If that's true, if they're communicating now, then everything we thought we knew about how to deal with them is useless. What's even more unnerving are the changes survivors are seeing in individual infected. Some of them are faster now, stronger, more agile. Survivors call them runners or stalkers, depending on how they move. These aren't just flukes or outliers. They're becoming more common, appearing in areas where the infected seem to gather in greater numbers. And they don't just move differently, they act differently. They don't attack blindly. They wait, watching, choosing their moment before striking. There's also a disturbing physical change happening in some infected. Survivors have reported seeing glowing marks on their skin. Faint at first, like veins illuminated from within, but growing brighter over time. These marks often resemble the spirals and patterns we've seen etched into the land and structures. It's as if the infection is evolving, reshaping the infected into something we don't yet understand. Then there's the sound. Survivors who've been near large groups of infected have described hearing low, rhythmic humming, almost like a chant. It doesn't come from their mouths. It seems to resonate from their bodies, a deep vibration that you feel more than hear. One group described how the humming grew louder as they approached, becoming almost deafening before they backed away. Whatever this sound is, it's not random. It feels purposeful, like a signal or a warning. What's most disturbing is how the infected seem drawn to certain areas. Survivors have noticed them gathering near the fissures, those glowing cracks in the ground we've talked about. Others have seen them congregating around old industrial sites or places marked with spirals. It's as if these locations hold some significance to them, as if they're being called there by something we can't see. I don't know what's driving these changes, if it's the infection itself, something in the environment, or a force we don't yet understand. But what I do know is that the infected are no longer just a force of chaos. They're becoming organized, deliberate, and dangerously efficient. Survivors, pay attention to the patterns. Watch how the infected move, where they gather, and how they respond to you. These changes aren't random, and they're not going to stop. The rules are shifting, and if we don't adapt, we're not going to survive. Survivors, let's talk about the messages we've been finding. They're everywhere now, etched into walls, carved into trees, scrawled on scraps of metal or stone. Some of them are warnings, some feel like commands, and others are harder to define. They're not just random acts of graffiti or the desperate scribbles of a world gone mad. These messages are deliberate, and the more we see them, the clearer it becomes. They're trying to tell us something. The most common message, of course, is run. Survivors have reported seeing it everywhere, from abandoned alleyways to the side of broken down vehicles. It's always written in bold, jagged letters, as if whoever left it wanted to make sure it couldn't be ignored. But what's strange is where it shows up. It's not in places you'd expect, like near infected hotspots or areas of obvious danger. No, these warnings appear in quiet places, places that feel almost safe. One survivor described finding the words scrawled across the door of an untouched cabin deep in the woods. The cabin looked secure, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. But when they stepped inside, they found the air thick with that metallic tang we've talked about before, and the feeling that something was watching them. They didn't stay long enough to find out what. Then there are the directional warnings. Don't go north, turn back, and stay out. These messages are more specific, and they're often accompanied by symbols, spirals, jagged lines, or crude arrows pointing toward or away from something. Survivors who've ignored these warnings rarely come back with good stories. One group who followed a trail marked with arrows and the phrase, "keep moving," found themselves in an area where the air seemed to vibrate, where their voices echoed in ways that didn't make sense. They turned back before they got too far, but they said the feeling of wrongness clung to them for days. Some messages seem more cryptic. Phrases like, "the sky listens," or "it's in the roots," have been found in multiple locations, often near environmental anomalies. Survivors have seen these words scratched into the bark of trees near spiraling patterns of grass, painted on rocks by rivers that glow faintly at night, or written in ash on the walls of buildings that feel colder than they should. What do they mean? Are they warnings, clues, or something else entirely? One thing's clear, they're not random. Let's talk about the symbols themselves. Spirals are the most common, but they're not the only ones. Survivors have reported finding concentric circles, jagged patterns that resemble lightning bolts, and strange geometric shapes that seem to pulse faintly under certain light. These symbols aren't just scrawled on surfaces. They're etched deep, as if whoever made them wanted them to last. Some appear burned into the ground, leaving behind patches of scorched earth that don't seem to heal. Others are carved into stone or metal with an intricacy that suggests more than just idle hands. What's unsettling is how these symbols seem to align with other phenomena. Survivors have noticed that areas marked with spirals often coincide with places where infected gather or where the air feels charged. One group described finding a spiral carved into the wall of a subway station. The air inside the station was heavy, and faint whispers seemed to echo off the walls, growing louder the closer they got to the marking. They left before they could figure out what was causing the sound, but they said the spiral stayed with them, burned into their minds like a memory they couldn't shake. Some messages seemed to shift over time. Survivors have reported returning to a place where they saw a warning, only to find the words changed. A sign that once read "safe" now says "not anymore." A wall marked with "stay away" was later found with the words "too late" scrawled over it in a different hand. It's as if the messages are alive, reacting to the world around them or to us. And then there are the messages that don't make sense at all. Survivors have found strings of numbers, coordinates that lead to empty fields or crumbling ruins, and phrases that seem like fragments of conversations. "IT won't stop. They see you. Keep quiet." These messages feel more personal, almost like they're meant for a specific person rather than the general survivor population. One survivor described finding their own name written on the wall of an abandoned house, followed by the words, "Look up." When they did, they saw a drone hovering in the distance, its lights flickering in an almost rhythmic pattern. What's most disturbing is that no one knows who's leaving these messages. Are they the work of other survivors, trying to warn us about dangers they've seen? Are they left by whatever forces are reshaping our world, guiding or manipulating us for reasons we can't understand? Or are they something else entirely, something we haven't even begun to consider? Survivors, these messages aren't just graffiti. They're pieces of a puzzle, fragments of a story we're still piecing together. If you see one, pay attention. Study it, map it, look for connections. But don't linger too long. These warnings, these symbols, they mean something. And whatever that meaning is, it's tied to the forces shaping our reality. Stay sharp and trust your instincts. Sometimes the message isn't what's written, it's where it leads. Survivors, it's becoming harder to deny that something larger is at work in this fractured world of ours. The shifts in the land, the behavior of the infected, the cryptic messages, they all point to forces we can't see but can feel all too clearly. Whatever is driving these changes, it's deliberate. The world isn't just breaking down, it's being reshaped. Let's start with the patterns in the landscape. Survivors have described spirals forming in places they shouldn't, grass growing in tight, unnatural loops, rivers carving out curved paths that seem to have no reason or origin. These aren't coincidences. They're deliberate marks left by something beyond our understanding. One group described a clearing they stumbled upon in a dense forest. The trees around it were twisted, their branches spiraling upward like a staircase to the sky. In the center of the clearing was a pool of water, perfectly still, with faint light flickering beneath the surface. They said it felt alive, like the whole clearing was breathing, watching. There's also the matter of the lights. Survivors have reported seeing strange glows in the distance, soft, pulsating orbs that hover above the ground or dart between the trees. These lights aren't just phenomena of the atmosphere. They're tied to something deeper. Survivors who've approached them describe feeling drawn in, like the light was calling to them, pulling them forward even when their instincts screamed to turn back. One man said he followed a light through the ruins of a factory, only to find it hovering above a symbol etched into the ground. The air around it was thick, charged with static, and he swore he could hear a faint humming, almost like a voice, though he couldn't make out the words. And then there are the whispers. I've mentioned them before, but they're growing more frequent, more insistent. Survivors across different regions have described hearing voices carried on the wind, faint and fragmented, but always there. They're not random noises. They're intentional, like someone or something is trying to communicate. One woman described standing in a field when she heard her name whispered, clear as day, though no one was there. The voice came again, this time softer, and she said it felt like it wasn't just calling her. It was searching for her. The infected seemed to be tied to these forces as well. Their behavior around areas marked by spirals or lights is too consistent to be coincidence. Survivors have seen infected gather in these places, standing in circles or moving in synchronized patterns. It's as if they're being guided by something we can't see. One group described a line of infected standing shoulder to shoulder across a field, blocking their path. They didn't move, didn't react to noise or light, just stood there like sentinels guarding something. What's even stranger is how the environment itself seems to respond to us. Survivors have reported areas where the air feels heavier, the ground softer, as though the land is alive and shifting in response to their presence. One man described walking through an abandoned town where the streets seemed to ripple beneath his feet, like water disturbed by a stone. He said the ripples grew stronger the farther he walked, until the ground itself seemed to collapse, revealing a void below. He turned and ran, but he said the feeling of the land moving stayed with him, like it was following him. The symbols we've been finding, spirals, jagged lines, geometric patterns, they're not just decorations. They're markers, part of a larger design we don't yet understand. Survivors have noticed that these symbols often appear in areas where strange phenomena occur. One group found a series of spirals carved into the walls of an old subway station. The air inside was thick with static, and the lights flickered in a way that didn't feel random. They said the spirals seemed to pulse, almost like they were alive, reacting to the electricity in the air. And what about the areas that seem to rewrite themselves? Survivors have reported places where time feels unstable, where hours stretch into minutes or days disappear in the blink of an eye. One group described walking through a forest where the sun never seemed to set, where the light stayed dim and golden no matter how long they traveled. They marked trees as they went, only to find their marks fading as soon as they were made. It was as if the forest was erasing them, undoing their presence. The question is, what's behind all of this? Is it the aftermath of the war, some side effect of the destruction we've unleashed on the world? Or is it something older, something we've awakened by breaking the balance of the natural order? Whatever it is, it's clear that these changes aren't random. They're purposeful, driven by forces that seem to be shaping the world according to their own design. We don't know what these forces want, but one thing is certain. They're not going away. They're growing stronger, more pronounced, and they're leaving their mark on everything they touch. Survivors, this isn't just a fight for survival anymore. It's a fight to understand the rules of a world that's no longer our own. Stay vigilant, and don't ignore the signs. The answers are out there, but they're not going to come easy. Survivors, it's easy to feel like the world is closing in on us, like we're being crushed under the weight of something too massive to fight. But amidst the chaos, there's one thing we still have: our humanity. It's fragile, sure. It bends under pressure, frays at the edges, but it hasn't broken. Not yet. And as long as we hold on to it, we have a chance not just to survive, but to rebuild something worth living for. Let's start with what that means. Holding on to humanity. It's not about grand gestures. Most of us don't have the luxury for that anymore. It's about the small things, the choices we make every day. It's sharing a meal with someone who's hungrier than you are. It's taking a moment to breathe when the world feels like it's pushing you to run. It's not giving in to the fear that makes us want to turn on each other. I've heard from survivors who have found ways to do this, even now, even here. One woman described how she's been leaving small bundles of supplies in places she's passed through. Just enough food or water to help the next person who stumbles across it. She doesn't wait around to see who finds them. She just leaves them and moves on. Another survivor told me about how his group has been marking safe paths through dangerous areas, carving symbols into trees or painting arrows on walls. It's risky work, but he said it's worth it to know that someone else might have a better chance because of what they've done. These acts might seem small, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but they're not. They're reminders that we're not alone, that we're still connected, even in a world that seems determined to tear us apart. Every time you reach out, every time you help someone else, you're defying the chaos. You're saying, this isn't who we are. This isn't how it ends. But holding on to humanity isn't just about what we do for others. It's also about what we do for ourselves. It's about finding moments of peace, even if they're fleeting. It's about remembering who we are, not just who we've become in the face of all this. One survivor told me how she's been keeping a journal, writing down her thoughts, her memories, the things she's seen. She said it helps her feel grounded, like she's still herself, even when everything else feels like it's slipping away. Another survivor shared how he's been carrying a photograph of his family with him, keeping it tucked into his coat, He said it's a reminder of what he's fighting for, of the life he wants to find again, or maybe rebuild from scratch. These things might seem small, but they're not. They're anchors, lifelines in a sea of uncertainty. I've also heard from survivors who've found ways to create something new in the ruins. One group described how they've been planting gardens in the rubble of their old neighborhood, growing what food they can, but also flowers, bright, defiant blooms in the shadow of destruction. Another survivor talked about how she's been teaching the children in her group songs, stories, ways to keep their minds sharp and their spirits alive. She said it's about more than just survival. It's about making sure they still have a future worth living for. And that's what it comes down to, isn't it? The future. It's hard to think about it when the present is so overwhelming. But we have to. If we lose sight of the future, we lose sight of everything. We have to believe that there's something beyond this, something better waiting for us on the other side. And the only way we get there is by holding on to the parts of ourselves that make us human. The kindness, the resilience, the hope. Hope is a tricky thing. It's not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's quiet, almost invisible, like a seed buried deep in the ground, waiting for the right moment to grow. But it's there. I've seen it in the stories you've shared, in the way you keep moving, keep fighting, keep living. Every time you choose to keep going, even when it feels impossible, you're choosing hope. So, survivors, keep choosing it. Keep holding on to the things that matter, the things that make you who you are. This world will try to strip them away from you. It will try to make you hard and cold, to convince you that kindness and connection are weaknesses. Don't let it, because those things aren't weaknesses, they're strength. They're the reason we're still here. We've been through hell, and we're not out of it yet. But as long as we have each other, as long as we have hope, we have a chance. A chance to survive, a chance to rebuild, a chance to be something more than just survivors. So hold on to that, no matter how hard it gets. Hold on to your humanity, because it's the most valuable thing we have left. Survivors, as I sit here and let the silence of the world settle in around me, I find myself thinking about the weight we all carry. It's not just the bags on our backs, the weapons in our hands, or the supplies we cling to like lifelines. It's the memories, the questions, the fears that never quite leave us. They're heavy, aren't they? But somehow we keep moving. I know many of you are listening right now, nodding along, thinking of the days when the weight felt unbearable. Maybe you've had to make choices you didn't think you could live with. Maybe you've lost people who mattered more than anything, and you've wondered how you're supposed to keep going without them. Let me tell you something, it's okay to feel that. It's okay to grieve, to ache, to stumble. None of this is easy. It's not supposed to be, but you're still here, and that counts for something. I want to remind you of something simple, something that's easy to forget when every day feels like a fight. You're more than what the world has tried to make you. You're not just survivors, clawing through the ruins for another chance to breathe. You're people with histories, with dreams, with reasons to keep moving forward. Hold on to those reasons, no matter how small they might seem. For me, it's this broadcast. It's the thought that maybe, somewhere out there, these words reach someone who needs to hear them. That maybe, in the quiet moments between the fear and the chaos, someone listens and remembers they're not alone. That's what keeps me going. What's yours? What's the thing that keeps you putting one foot in front of the other, even when the road ahead looks endless? Think about it. Hold it close. Let it remind you of who you are, not just who you've had to become. This world wants to take everything from us. Our homes, our safety, even our sense of self. Don't let it. Resist in every way you can, not just with weapons or barricades, but with the choices you make every day. Choose to remember the people you've lost, not just for their absence, but for the joy they brought while they were here. Choose to keep their stories alive, their laughter, their lessons. It's not just about holding on to the past. It's about carrying it with you into the future, about letting it shape the person you're trying to be. And while you're at it, take a moment to think about the people around you. Maybe it's a group you've been traveling with for weeks. Maybe it's the stranger you passed on the road, who nodded in quiet understanding before moving on. Maybe it's the voice on the other end of a makeshift radio just like this one. Whoever they are, they're part of this fight too. We're not alone, even when it feels that way. The connections we make, however fleeting, are what remind us that we're still human. They're what make the difference between surviving and living. So take care of each other, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. I know the world feels bigger and scarier than ever, like it's full of shadows that stretch too far and whispers that cut too deep. But even in the darkest places, there's light. You've seen it, I know you have. The moments when a stranger shares a bottle of water, when a child laughs at something silly, when you look up and catch a glimpse of the stars through the broken clouds. Those moments matter. They're rare, sure, but they're real. And they remind us that there's still beauty in this broken world, still something worth fighting for. Don't let that beauty slip away. Survivors, notice it, hold on to it. Let it guide you when the path ahead feels impossible to navigate. As I speak to you now, I'm thinking about all the places you might be hearing this from. Maybe you're holed up in an old shelter, the walls thick enough to keep the world out for a little while. Maybe you're walking down a cracked highway, the wind at your back and the horizon stretching out in front of you. Maybe you're somewhere I can't even imagine, carving out your own little piece of hope in a world that doesn't want to give it to you. Wherever you are, know this, you're not alone. There's a network of people out there, all trying to make it, all hoping for a future that feels just a little less heavy. You might not see them, you might never meet them, but they're there, listening, surviving just like you. And maybe, just maybe, one day we'll all find each other. Maybe the fragments of humanity scattered across this broken world will come together again. It won't be easy, it won't be fast, but it's possible. And as long as it's possible, it's worth fighting for. So keep going, survivors. Keep moving forward, one step at a time, one day at a time. Trust yourselves, trust each other, and trust that even in the darkness, there's light to be found. You're stronger than you know, braver than you feel, and more important than you realize. This is Atlas, signing off for now. I'll be here as long as I can, sending these words out into the void, hoping they find you. Until next time, stay sharp, stay safe, and stay human.